opening up diagonals for the queen and bishop immediately. This stake in the center promises dynamic play. Challenging white's central influence immediately, this Sicilian setup embraces a dynamic fight for space and aims for active counterplay on the queen side. Developing the knight to f3 efficiently challenges black's central pawn and prepares for castling, a key step in safeguarding the king. Developing the knight to a natural square prepares for central pawn advances and offers a solid foundation for the Sicilian defense. Challenging the center immediately, this move sparks an open battle for central space and dynamic piece play. Exchanging pawns here immediately opens the center, offering white a dynamic advantage due to their development lead. This pawn grab immediately opens lines for white's pieces, creating dynamic play and contesting the center. Striking the center, this pawn push immediately challenges white's knight and aims to seize more space. Unleashing a knight to press on the d6 square, this knight's outpost creates immediate pressure, demanding black's attention and potentially disrupting their pawn structure. Steering clear of early skirmishes, black solidifies the pawn chain and opens a vital diagonal for the queen. Solidifying the pawn center, white now stakes a claim on squares d5 and e5, creating a robust pawn chain that will restrict black's knight and bishop development on the queen side. Black strategically reinforces the central pawn structure and prepares to castle, solidifying their position after white's aggressive pawn push. This development also subtly prepares for future kingside castling, a crucial defensive maneuver in this Sicilian setup. Reinforcing the central knight's presence and preparing to contest the d5 square, this move asserts white's growing influence in the core of the board. It also opens avenues for further pawn advances and knight maneuvers, aiming to restrict black's pieces. Pressuring white's knight directly, this pawn advances to contest space and prepare for potential queenside expansion, forcing a decision for the knight that just arrived at its advanced outpost. Relocating the knight to the rim often signals a shift in priorities, perhaps aiming to reinforce the queenside or prepare a broader development. This maneuver, however, sacrifices immediate central influence for a more passive outpost, inviting black to seize the initiative in the core of the board. Solidifying the center and preparing for kingside development, this bishop neatly tucks away, anticipating the pawn chain's advance and offering defensive coverage. Focusing on piece development and central influence, this placement bolsters the kingside and prepares for castling, while also controlling the d3 square and subtly pressuring black's queenside pawn structure. Challenging the central pawn structure, black immediately seeks to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and open lines for their own. The knight's relocation to d4 exerts pressure on the e2 bishop and hints at further central infiltration, potentially creating imbalances and forcing white into defensive maneuvers. Securing the king's safety allows white to consolidate their forces and prepare for more dynamic action, while simultaneously preventing any immediate tactical skirmishes on the kingside. Developing the knight to its most active square, this knight now eyes the central squares and aims to participate in the coming pawn storm, potentially reinforcing black's d6 pawn and preparing for further queenside expansion or even a kingside attack. Solidifying the central pawn structure and preparing to castle kingside, the bishop's development here aims to contribute to the impending kingside attack and potentially support an eventual kingside advance of pawns. Striking the knight on e2 immediately offers a chance to simplify, potentially liberating the d6 pawn and opening lines for your pieces. However, be keenly aware that this also forces a queen trade if white accepts, potentially leading to a more open board where your king might feel a tad exposed if development lags. Consider the long-term pawn structure implications following this exchange. Will it create lasting weaknesses or empower your central control? Reclaiming the queen to the center clears the e-file and positions her to support potential pawn pushes on the queen side, while also eyeing the king side if black falters in castling. Safeguarding the king from any immediate threats is paramount, and castling accomplishes this beautifully, tucking it behind a newly formed pawn shield. This move also brings a rook into play, anticipating future central pawn advances or the opening of files for more aggressive operations. It prioritizes defensive security while simultaneously improving piece coordination, a hallmark of sound middle-game strategy. The rooks are finally connecting on the d-file, eyeing the opponent's somewhat exposed king and aiming to wrestle for central control, forcing black to react to the immediate pressure. Injecting immediate chaos into white's queenside, this knight boldly ventures into uncharted territory, challenging the bishop on e3 and threatening to unravel the solid pawn structure. Establishing control over the d2 square with this bishop solidifies the pawn chain and prepares for potential central pawn advances like f4, aiming to gain space and restrict black's knights. Black immediately challenges white's central control by pushing the f-pawn, aiming to disrupt white's harmony and open lines for their pieces, particularly the queen and rook. This aggressive pawn thrust also seeks to gain more space on the kingside, potentially preparing for a future pawn storm or to create weaknesses in white's pawn structure. It's a bold attempt to seize the initiative and dictate the game's direction, though it could leave the kingside somewhat exposed if not properly supported. Releasing the pawn chain opens lines and creates immediate tactical possibilities, forcing black to decide how to handle the exposed knight and the newly created central weaknesses. Unleashing the bishop to reclaim the pawn opens up black's queenside, creating immediate tension around the d1 rook and the white queen. This active repositioning forces white to consider their next steps carefully, potentially disrupting their planned maneuvers. The piece exchange, while seemingly simplifying, injects a dynamic element, as black's bishop now eyes the central dark squares and prepares for potential pawn pushes. Preparing for a potential king's side assault, white repositions the bishop, freeing the f-file and aiming to connect the rooks. Black actively combats white's central pawn structure by initiating pawn play on the queenside, aiming to destabilize white's pieces and potentially open lines for their own attacking forces. Injecting a powerful knight into the heart of black's position, this maneuver aims to disrupt their defensive structure and create immediate tactical opportunities. Unpinning the knight by developing the other one allows for better defense of the kingside and prepares for future counterplay on the queenside, potentially challenging white's control of the c-file. Trading off a knight for a bishop here, a seemingly straightforward exchange, actually resolves significant tension on the kingside and opens a vital diagonal for white's queen to survey the board. The immediate consequence is the dissolution of black's aggressive knight outpost on f6, forcing a reshuffling of their defensive structure and creating potential weaknesses around their king that white can now exploit. Reclaiming central files with the rook immediately reasserts black's presence, preparing to contest the open d-file and aiming to disrupt white's currently passive bishop placement. Establishing a dominant presence on the open c-file presents a compelling strategic objective, aiming to coordinate the rooks and potentially exert pressure on black's queenside. The queen ventures forward, seeking to disrupt white's d-file ambitions and potentially exploit any lingering weaknesses around the king, while simultaneously eyeing the c4 pawn. White endeavors to untangle the rooks and prepare for potential central advances by repositioning the rook from the open c-file. The rook's relocation to the g-file immediately injects dynamic pressure, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses around white's castled king and simultaneously prepare for an aggressive pawn thrust with f5. Opening the g-file with this rook maneuver immediately challenges black's pawn structure and aims to exploit the potential weakness around the king, creating a distinct imbalance and forcing black into a defensive posture by generating threats on the open file. Exchanging the rook for the knight immediately simplifies the position, potentially opening lines for your remaining pieces, but also surrendering the crucial g-file that the rook was contesting. Consider how this impacts your defensive setup and whether the ensuing exchanges create any vulnerabilities around your king. Opening the h-file with the pawn push creates immediate pressure on black's kingside, aiming to exploit the otherwise passive rook on g8 and potentially target the king down the line. This aggressive pawn advance, however, does weaken white's own king's shelter slightly, creating a potential risk if black can reroute pieces effectively. Black reestablishes a dynamic piece of the board, targeting white's now doubled pawns and potentially opening lines towards the king. opening the queen side and preparing to contest the open c-file with the rook. This move also creates a subtle pawn weakness on c2 that might become exploitable later if black can generate pressure there. Black's queen, now venturing to the center, is a daring probe, immediately challenging white's pawn structure and threatening to disrupt the delicate balance on the queen side where white has just solidified with b3. This assertive placement forces white to consider immediate defensive measures, rather than continuing with their planned expansion, potentially creating imbalances that could be exploited later. Executing this queen exchange fundamentally alters the dynamic, ushering in a new phase where white aims to exploit the open files and black seeks counterplay with active pieces. Black solidifies their pawn structure and liberates the rook, preparing to contest open files. Securing the queenside perimeter, white strategically anchors the bishop to pressure black's pawn structure and deny black's rook's easy access to the c-file, preparing for a potential kingside initiative while maintaining solid control of central dark squares. The rook's repositioning aims to activate this heavy piece on the open c-file, potentially eyeing advanced pawns or offering support for further pawn pushes. Unlocking the kingside, this advance seeks to disrupt black's pawn structure and create attacking chances by opening the f-file for white's rook and potentially the g-file as well. This maneuver redirects the king from its exposed central position, seeking relative safety on the flank while subtly preparing for potential endgame transitions and offering better defensive coverage of the kingside. Opening the h-file presents a double-edged sword. While it creates a direct line to black's king, it also exposes white's own monarch to potential threats along that newly opened corridor. Reclaiming the pawn and unlocking the d-file opens up significant counterplay for black, aiming to activate the rook and challenge white's slightly scattered pieces. Opening the bishop's diagonal to support the central pawn advance is a key strategic maneuver. Suddenly, the game pivots towards an endgame where black's exposed monarch presents a tangible target, a consequence of the previous exchanges and the now open files. Reclaiming the open file after the rook exchange signals a decisive shift towards activating your remaining rook, aiming to exert pressure on black's exposed king and potentially create pawn breaks on the kingside. Shifting the bishop to g6 prepares to contest the open c-file and potentially develop a more active role, even though the immediate pawn structure looks a bit cumbersome after the recent exchanges. Seizing the open file with this rook check immediately disrupts black's pawn structure and forces a concession, opening paths towards black's vulnerable king. The rook's repositioning opens a direct avenue for white's king's safety to become a pressing concern, potentially unlocking a decisive attack along the newly created diagonal. Initiating the exchange of queens simplifies the position, bringing us closer to an endgame where piece activity and pawn structure will be paramount. The black king, no longer shielded by pawns, steps into the fray, aiming to become an active participant in the dwindling material. This maneuver signals a decisive shift towards an endgame where a king's mobility becomes paramount, forcing white to remain vigilant against potential infiltration and pawn breakthroughs. The white king boldly ventures out, aiming to participate in the upcoming pawn skirmishes and secure a more active post in this simplified endgame. Safeguarding the monarch's newfound freedom becomes paramount, as this relocation opens up a critical central square for the black king, potentially influencing both the fight for the d-file and the fate of white's advanced pawns. Consolidating the monarch is paramount as the queens are gone. The white king ventures out, aiming to occupy a central square and disrupt black's pieces. Unleashing the bishop to d3 offers a remarkable outpost and a shield for the king, while also creating future pawn breakthroughs along the kingside. Opening the g-file to potentially infiltrate with the rook presents a direct challenge to black's king, forcing a decision on how to defend the pawn structure. Sacrificing the bishop for pawn structure now invites a swift king hunt down the open g-file. Repositioning the knight to the queenside aims to reactivate it and potentially contest the open files, though its current placement feels somewhat passive after the extensive exchanges. Suddenly, the bishop ventures towards the kingside, a bold repositioning that aims to exploit any lingering weaknesses around white's monarch and potentially stir up counterplay. The king ventures forward, seeking to activate its role in the approaching endgame and solidify its position in the center. Bringing the monarch to the forefront establishes a crucial defensive outpost in the center, simultaneously preparing to launch a counteroffensive on the queen's side and threatening to infiltrate white's weakened pawn structure. Shifting the monarch towards the queen's side opens up a vital diagonal for potential pawn advancement, aiming to create a passed threat while keeping the king out of immediate danger from the bishop's harassment. Shifting the bishop to f1 initiates a bold maneuver, aiming to redeploy this key piece and potentially disrupt white's coordinated pawn structure or prepare for future defensive duties by supporting the d4 square. The knight's repositioning to d2 aims to achieve central influence and prepare for potential pawn advances on the king side, seeking to exploit the now somewhat exposed black monarch. Inviting the opponent's bishop to a more active square, this maneuver from black aims to stir up the quiescent central position and perhaps uncover attacking potential against white's somewhat compromised kingside pawn structure. The monarch ventures out, aiming to contest the center and potentially create counterplay against black's awkwardly placed bishop. Seizing a moment of initiative, black seeks to disrupt white's consolidated position and potentially activate their own king.